Every book on his shelf was about his future. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight cutting through the heavy library curtains, illuminating a scene that was, to any casual observer, entirely unremarkable. Yet, for Elias Thorne, a man of 47 years, and the sole occupant of the room, this commonplace spectacle held the gravity of a divine revelation. Every single book on his shelf, from the worn, thumb-marked spines to the pristine, unopened tomes, wasn't merely a collection of stories or facts. It was a roadmap, a prophecy, a whisper of his impending future. He believed this with an unshakable conviction that had only deepened with the quiet passing of decades. His shelves weren't categorized by genre or author. Instead, they were meticulously arranged by what Elias perceived as temporal proximity. The books closest to his worn leather armchair, within easy reach, were those he considered to be about his immediate future, the next few days, perhaps a week. Further along, stretching the entire length of the oak wall, were the volumes detailing months and years, receding into the hazy uncertainty of his distant destiny. It was a system known only to him, a silent covenant between a man and his chosen literary oracle. Take, for instance, the slim, unassuming volume titled The Art of Competitive Bird Watching. Elias had acquired it a week ago, a peculiar purchase even for him, a man of many quiet eccentricities. He'd initially dismissed it as an anomaly, a rogue element in his otherwise perfectly aligned system. But then, a flyer appeared in his mailbox, announcing the annual district bird watching competition, held just a few blocks from his quiet suburban home. He'd never shown an interest in ornithology, but the book sat there, a silent challenge. It was a minor incident, certainly, but to Elias, it was a profound affirmation of his unique foresight. The book hadn't just predicted an event, it had demanded his participation. He knew, with a certainty that hummed in his bones, that his future, however mundane, was always foreshadowed on his shelves. Elias, a man of methodical habits, had a ritual for each morning. He would wake precisely at 6, make a single cup of black coffee, and then settle into his armchair, the one with the slight tear in the armrest. He wouldn't pick up a book immediately. First, he would simply look at the shelves, allowing his gaze to drift, searching for any subtle shift in the arrangement, any new gleam on a spine, any dust motes that seemed to dance with a particular urgency around a specific title. Sometimes, a book that had been nestled deep within the distant future section would suddenly feel closer, its presence more insistent, pulling at his attention. These were the omens, the silent harbingers of what was to come. His life, outwardly, was a portrait of quiet solitude. He'd inherited the house from his aunt, a woman who had, much like Elias, found solace in the quiet company of books. She had filled the house with them, though her collection had been a chaotic, joyful mess, a stark contrast to Elias's ordered prophecy. Elias had never married, never had children. His connections to the outside world were minimal. The gruff but kind postman, Mr. Henderson, a man in his late 60s, who always left the mail with a gentle tap on the door and a quick, polite nod, and Mrs. Gable, the sprightly woman in her early 50s who cleaned his house once a week, her cheerful chatter a welcome, if sometimes overwhelming, counterpoint to his usual silence. Today, however, Elias felt a peculiar unease. His gaze kept returning to a section of the shelf he rarely consulted, the one dedicated to books about travel, particularly long journeys. There sat a worn copy of Journeys to the Unseen World, a book he'd owned for years but had never opened. He'd always assumed it was about metaphorical journeys, spiritual quests. But this morning, its presence felt different. It hummed with a quiet intensity, almost vibrating with an unspoken message. He felt a faint tremor of anxiety, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. His future, it seemed, was preparing for a significant shift, one that might pull him from the comfortable confines of his predictable existence. He considered the other books surrounding Journeys to the Unseen World. Next to it was The Complete Guide to Remote Cabin Living, and further down, Survival in the Wilderness, a beginner's handbook. These were not the usual fare for Elias, whose idea of an adventure was a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. The collective weight of these titles, their silent declarations, pointed to something far grander, far more unsettling, than competitive bird watching. Elias spent the morning in a state of quiet contemplation. He dusted his shelves, a meticulous process that allowed him to touch each book, to feel its presence, to absorb its silent wisdom. He ran his fingers over the spine of Journeys to the Unseen World, its rough texture feeling strangely significant. He tried to decipher its meaning, to understand what kind of journey it foretold. Was it a literal journey? A forced relocation? A sudden, unexpected trip? His mind, usually so clear in its interpretations of the books, found itself struggling to find a solid footing. The afternoon brought Mrs. Gable, a whirlwind of cheerful energy and the scent of lemon polish. She moved through the house with a practiced efficiency, her hums filling the silence Elias usually embraced. She knew of Elias's peculiar habit, of course. She'd once, years ago, innocently moved a book from one shelf to another while cleaning, and Elias had spent the rest of the day in a state of profound distress, convinced he had irrevocably altered his destiny. Since then, she approached his library with the reverence of a museum curator. "Still reading your future, Mr. Thorne," she chirped, her voice light and teasing, as she dusted the top of a tall bookshelf. Elias offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't elaborate, didn't feel the need to justify his beliefs. Mrs. Gable understood, in her own way, that this was simply him. As Mrs. Gable continued her work, Elias's gaze kept returning to Journeys to the Unseen World. He knew he had to open it, to confront its message. He finally reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. The book felt heavier than he remembered, imbued with a strange, almost magnetic pull. He settled back into his armchair, the leather creaking softly in protest, and opened the book to a random page. The page he landed on was a detailed diagram of celestial navigation, accompanied by an intricate description of constellations and star charts. Elias, who had always found the night sky a beautiful but distant spectacle, felt a jolt. This was not a metaphorical journey. This was literal. This was about going somewhere, far away, under the guidance of the stars. The meaning, once murky, began to sharpen into a terrifying clarity. He was going on a journey. A long one. Later that evening, after Mrs. Gable had departed, leaving the house smelling of citrus and quiet order, Elias found himself drawn to another section of his shelves, one he had always considered to be purely theoretical. These were the books on skills he'd never imagined needing: basic first aid for the wilderness, foraging for edible plants, and, most unsettling of all, how to build a shelter from found materials. He pulled out Basic First Aid, its pages crisp and untouched, and placed it on his reading table, a silent acceptance of the future it seemed to be revealing. The next few days were a quiet escalation of these omens. A brochure for a remote hiking retreat, hidden among his usual bills. A news report about an unusually strong geomagnetic storm, capable of disrupting global navigation systems. And then, the ultimate confirmation: a small, unassuming package arrived in the mail. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a compass. Not a cheap, decorative one, but a sturdy, professional-grade compass, with luminous markings and a robust casing. It had no sender's address. It simply was. Elias held the compass in his palm, its cool metal a solid anchor in his trembling hand. The reality of his future, whispered by his books and now confirmed by tangible objects, settled over him with a profound weight. He was going on a journey, a demanding one that would require skills he did not possess and a resilience he had never tested. He began, slowly, to prepare. He started by rereading Basic First Aid, absorbing every detail, picturing himself in remote, challenging circumstances. He studied the foraging guide, surprised by the sheer variety of edible plants he had unknowingly walked past for years. He even attempted, with comical results, to fashion a small shelter from old blankets and chairs in his living room, a practice run for the real thing. His quiet life, once a predictable rhythm, was now punctuated by these strange, urgent preparations. One afternoon, as he was meticulously packing a small backpack with essentials, a water filter, a first aid kit, a small knife, Mr. Henderson, the postman, arrived with a special delivery. It was a thick, legal-looking envelope. Elias opened it with a sense of foreboding. Inside was a letter from a distant, hitherto unknown relative, a great aunt he'd never heard of, who had recently passed away. The letter informed him that he was the sole heir to her remote cabin, nestled deep within a vast, untouched wilderness, miles from the nearest road. The cabin, the letter stated, required his immediate presence to sort out the estate. Elias read the letter again, his eyes scanning the details, the precise location, the remote coordinates. Then, he looked at his shelves. Journeys to the Unseen World. The Complete Guide to Remote Cabin Living. Survival in the Wilderness. How to Build a Shelter from Found Materials. The compass on his table. It all clicked into place, a symphony of foresight, a narrative woven by the silent threads of his books. His future wasn't just being whispered, it was shouting. He wouldn't be alone on this journey. The letter also mentioned a caretaker, a man who had looked after the property for years, Silas, a grizzled old man in his early 70s, who knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. Elias knew, with a certainty that calmed his racing heart, that Silas would be the embodiment of the skills detailed in survival in the wilderness. The day of departure arrived. Elias, carrying his newly acquired backpack, a small but significant weight on his shoulders, stood by his front door. Mrs. Gable had come to see him off, her usual cheerfulness tinged with a genuine concern. She fussed over him, adjusting his scarf, pressing a small, homemade scone into his hand. "You'll be careful out there, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice softer than usual. "And come back to us, mind." Elias offered her a rare, genuine smile. "The books say I will, Mrs. Gable," he replied, a quiet assurance in his voice. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that his return, too, was already written on those silent, watchful shelves. His future wasn't just about the journey, it was about the journey's end, and the knowledge that the books would continue to guide him, always.